in some regards. It's not like we're sitting down there and doing differential calculus or anything like that. Hey there, bibliophiles. Welcome to another episode of From the Archives, a book review podcast where I talk about a book from my library and whether you should or shouldn't read it. I'm Eric, a professor of anthropology at Cuyahoga Community College, Tri-C for short, and welcome to my library. The books in my library are sometimes old, sometimes rare, sometimes normal, but always interesting. Every episode I ask myself the following questions about the book or books that I'm reviewing. What's it about? Who wrote it? What are other people saying about it? And should I shelve it or shove it? Should I can it or keep it? Chuck it or cherish it? Reread or recycle? Shelve it or shove it? Or jettison or set it in? That last one comes from an episode where we talked about the book Jet Set, but that's neither here nor there. With all that being said, let's talk about, or rather let's pull some books from the bookshelf. And I guess it's kind of antiquated now, 20 episodes in. I don't actually pull the books from the bookshelf anymore, but that's probably mostly because this week we're talking about Intro to Anthropology textbooks. Last week we talked about Intro to Archaeology textbooks, so it's kind of a nice juxtaposition, the two of them. And luckily for those who are watching on YouTube, Tony the Turtle, Tony the Turtle, middle name Franklin, after Franklin the Turtle, is giving us a little bit of illumination here for the books. I found it kind of does a good job of showing off all the different textbooks. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 textbooks to review. Now, just like the Intro to Archaeology textbooks episode, some of these are, multiple or later editions of the same book. So I think I've got a couple in here that are like the second and then the third edition. And then I've also got a few that are duplicates and then third edition. So of course I have 3 copies of the textbook I use in my class actively right now. Like this summer, I will be teaching with Cultural Anthropology, the third edition by Ken Guest. And I guess we'll kind of kick things off with this one. I don't particularly mind using Ken Guest. The thing with Tri-C to keep in mind, at least from my perspective as a community college professor, is because we have an eastern campus, a metro campus, a western campus, a lakeshore campus, and then I think there's a Brunswick campus. Yeah, Brunswick. So there's like 4 or 5 campuses across the county. And students could take a class in eastern campus or western. And what we want at Tri-C is consistency. And so it's not so much every professor, and this might be getting in the weeds a little bit, but some colleges, depending on what professor you take, you might have a different textbook offered. So if you're taking Anthropology 101, or in our case, Anthropology 1010 at Tri-C, it doesn't matter which professor you're taking it in or what campus you're taking it in, it's always the same textbook. And that's kind of nice, that standardization, but the drawback is I don't necessarily get to always have the unilateral vote on what the textbook is going to be. Obviously, I have some weight in deciding what textbooks work, and I have no problem with this textbook. That being said, we want to have standardization. So all of us use the same textbook here. So I wasn't the one who first picked Ken Guest. I was kind of given Ken Guest when I first started teaching at Tri-C, and then I haven't really had any complaints about it myself, so I've just continued to use it. Haven't really felt the need to use a new textbook. But that being said, all that context to say the one thing I don't like about Ken Guest is that he's published 2 versions of his book. He has Cultural Anthropology, and this one has Shibuya Crossing in Japan as the cover on it. And it's like a nice glossy paperback, pretty thick here, textbook sized. I mean, nothing really to write home about in that regard. But he has a second version that's contemporaneous. So basically the same edition comes out, third edition, but then also Essentials for Cultural Anthropology. So literally the only difference is the word Essentials for, the words Essentials for being added to the textbook. The cover's different, and the text is a little bit different. I can't tell you how many times I've had students who don't notice the Essentials for, and they just assume that they're getting the right textbook, and they're not the same textbook. Like, they're slightly different. There's a couple chapters that are out of order. Some chapters are completely omitted. So that's one frustrating thing I've found in teaching is how many different versions of textbooks there are out there and how similar, the second edition from the first edition is, or, so on and so forth, different iterations. A lot of the times, like the Intro to Archaeology textbooks, I found that the differences between the editions wasn't really anything significant. It was just sort of like rearranging page numbers and whatnot. Whereas with cultural anthropology, with all of these books that I have here, and if you want a full list of all the books that I'm reviewing, rather than sort of auction house laundry list them all here, I'll highlight a few of them. But of the 10 books, all of them are going to end up on the book bin Google sheet that you can see in the show notes if you want to check those out as well. But anyway, back to my point about cultural anthropology books. I found that with cultural anthropology books, time is of the essence, and so a book from, say, I've got a cultural anthropology book here by Carol Ember and Melvin Ember from the 1970s. And the difference between this book and Ken Guest's book from 2020 is immense in terms of the cultural relevancy. So obviously some of the big key terms and concepts aren't changing through time. Like we still talk about ethnographic field methods, we talk about ethics, morals, concepts and kinship. I mean, a lot of the old classic readings are still in both of them, right? So we're going to talk about unilineal evolutionists and why we don't do that anymore. We're going to talk about Franz Boas. We're going to talk about E.B. Tyler, talk about Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Immanuel Wallerstein, and world systems theory. Talking about pretty much all the same names, but the examples used in the textbook are obviously going to change. The 1970s is going to look very different from 2020. And so what's nice about, I would say, Intro to Anthropology textbooks, and one of the reasons I would argue for constantly updating them, is because cultures change and we want to stay up to date and current with them. Not to say that archaeology textbooks don't need to be adjusting as much, but I mean, there's only so many ways you can dig a hole. Teaching someone excavation methods and survey sampling and all that kind of stuff hasn't really changed much in the last 60 years. Obviously, we've had easier ways to do it through things like transits and, Google and with spreadsheet applications and computers. But the basic nuts and bolts of it hasn't changed much. Again, the same's true of anthropology, but I would say the context in which things are being discussed is always changing. So, for example, even the 2020 edition of the textbook that I use, I mean, shoot, it came out like January of 2021 or 2020. Talk about outdated like that. I mean, this textbook missed COVID, it missed Black Lives Matter, it missed George Floyd, it missed the presidential election, it missed so much that happened. I mean, it missed, who could I mean, I guess you could forget because 2020 was a long year. The bombings of the Iranian generals by Trump back in like January, and we all thought we were going to be going to war with Iran. I mean, that was totally missed in this 2020 edition. So those are relevant to the discussion, especially in chapters that are about politics and power, or chapters on race and racism. I think that's where I'll pause and sort of give my brief overview of like what's it about in terms of cultural anthropology textbooks. After like reviewing all of these and reading, most of them, I wouldn't say I read all of them cover to cover. I mean, for the most part, you're pretty much getting the gist of things. The only thing that's going to be changing is, like I said, current events, recent examples that are going to be called out in the textbook because, they're textbooks, so they want to talk about current events. But generally speaking, I found a pretty consistent pattern in Intro to Anthropology textbooks, except for, there's two in here that are slightly different. I've got anthropology textbooks follow very similar formats, at least in terms of chapter organization, table of contents, and content delivery, except the differences are mostly in current events and topics that they choose to call out, except for these two books that I've pulled out. And it's Cultural Anthropology, A Problem-Based Approach by Richard Robbins, and Anthropology, 4th edition by Carol Ember and Melvin Ember. So what was interesting is, and I'll talk about what makes these two different, but first I have to establish what's similar about all these other textbooks. And I've got textbooks by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yes, at least 7, I think 8 different authors here wrote these Intro to Anthropology textbooks. But almost every single one of them pretty much follows this format. They might change the title of the chapter or the section, but almost all of them follow this same format, where they start off with the chapter called What is Culture?, where we establish, cultural anthropology, we're studying culture, but what the heck is culture? Usually that's followed up with a lesson on ethnographic field methods, methodology, ethics, morals. So basically, research methodology, field methods. Similar to how in archaeology textbooks, it starts off with the history of the discipline, what we study, and then it jumps right into field methods and survey methods. Then the next thing that usually comes is a lesson on ethnicity or race, or either as individual chapters or combined. So I think this is something worth dwelling on, is that all of these books give, I would say, at least a chapter talking about ethnicity and race as constructed concepts, because it's very important to understand race and racism in cultural anthropology and why those things exist. And so again, that's why things like 2020, has radically changed, I would say, the discourse around race and racism. Obviously, it's changing the direction that which conversations are being had, and so that's something that we need to incorporate into intro to anthropology textbooks. And then that's usually followed up with a linguistics chapter. What I find interesting is linguistics gets called out in cultural anthropology, but generally speaking, physical anthropology and archaeology don't get their own chapters, even though it feels sort of like in the episode where we talked about intro to archaeology textbooks, it sort of felt like these intro to archaeology textbooks, some of them tried to juggle physical anthropology, cultural anthropology. They try to juggle everything in anthropology in one textbook. Whereas in cultural anthropology, they don't really give lip service to physical anthropology. Although in Ken Guest's old editions, he used to have a chapter on human evolution, but rightly so, he got rid of it. And I think that was mostly because it just seemed out of place. It seemed shoehorned in when, we have a whole human evolution class, or at least most colleges have a whole separate class for human evolution. Just leave it in there. Let cultural anthropology focus on cultural anthropology. Don't try to do too much in a book. So linguistics is the only one that gets kind of thrown into cultural anthropology. You don't really see it too much in the intro to archaeology or in the human evolution textbooks. And then there's usually an economics chapter. So I found a lot of these textbooks use the term specifically making a living, which I thought was interesting, as opposed to, say, like global economics, which is what they use in Ken Guest's version. Although really there's multiple breakdowns of, there's a section on class and inequality, and then there's also a section on the global economy, in addition to a chapter on globalization. And so how you choose to divvy up sort of these concepts seems to be the main difference between these textbooks. Some books, like the one that I use in my class, has a whole chapter on globalization. What the heck does that mean to be globalized? I can't tell you how many times a student asks me, like, well, what does it mean, globalization? So there's a whole chapter on it in our textbook. And then dividing up a chapter on the global economy, and then having a chapter on class and inequality. And then other times I've seen some textbooks in this sample that I have, particularly like Invitation to Anthropology by Conrad Kotak, that's Eric Lasseter. Mirror for Humanity is Conrad Kotak. Both of those versions tend to sort of lump all of that stuff into making a living. But it's complex stuff, and I honestly think it is better to parse apart those concepts, because at least in teaching for the last 3 years now, cultural anthropology, I found teaching the economic stuff is sometimes the hardest stuff for students to grasp. And that's just because the economic stuff is the hardest for them to grasp. And I think that's just because it's sort of out of left field for them, at least as students. Generally speaking, cultural anthropology students either are, freshmen or sophomores, or they're getting an Associates of Arts or a Bachelor's of Arts, and so they haven't really had a lot of economics exposure, which is oftentimes stats heavy, and it's oftentimes using mathematical principles and theories of economics that just isn't in a lot of students' wheelhouse. And so I think it's really good to start to subdivide that up so you can have foundational building blocks, because they might not have been exposed to that earlier in their academic career. Or at least that's my perspective on it. And maybe that's just me having experienced hundreds of students who sometimes get lost when talking about like the Gini index, which is used in a lot of these textbooks, or talking about inequality, talking about Karl Marx, talking about Pierre Bourdieu, or Bordeaux. I can't remember how you pronounce it. Emile Durkheim, and a lot of these, or Immanuel Wallerstein, World Systems Theory, a lot of this stuff can be a little complex and theoretical for students, and I think it's sometimes hard to grasp because it is very theory heavy and math heavy, but it's still complex enough that I think it warrants being broken down. And so some of these books that don't break down the economic stuff as much, I would say they're not in my top list of books that I would choose. And that's primarily just from an educator's standpoint of, I think by glossing over that stuff, they're really losing out, especially considering most of my students, when they take the cultural anthropology class, especially in 2021, a lot of these concepts are familiar to them. I mean, the discourse and dialogue around race is obviously front and center. So a lot of the stuff that's in the textbook is like, oh yeah, I've seen this on TikTok, I've seen this on Twitter, I've seen this on the news, I've seen this on Facebook. The discourse around race is so prevalent, whereas I think there's less so discussions on social media in this day and age about economic concepts that everyone's talking about. You hear people, I mean, I think Andrew Yang did a great job of getting people thinking about new economic concepts, but in general, talking about the concept of reciprocity, talking about, market exchange, talking about class and inequality, I think they don't get as much critical attention as some of these other big topics like race, class, ethnicity, or not class, race, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, that are currently getting a lot of attention on social media. Now I still have, I guess I should wrap up what else is in a typical intro to anthropology textbook. You've got, then after your economic stuff, you've got political organization. So that's where we talk about things like, and almost all of them, even though they say Elman Service's for system typology is out of date, it never fails. It's such a convenient shorthand that even though the intro to anthropology textbooks all say it's not a very good typology, and yet they still use it in their books to organize political systems. And this is basically, for those that don't know, Elman Service back in the 50s developed this idea of political organization as band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. So those are the four main political organizations or societal organizations that you can sort of group people into as a broad brushstroke typology. And it definitely has a lot of flaws. And we could get into those flaws in the sense of it's kind of useful if you're just thinking of things in terms of population sizes. So like bands are typically 25 to 100 people. Tribes usually range in the populations of, small hundreds to like say 5,000. And then once you get into like 5,000 to like low tens of thousands of people, you're in chiefdom area. And then anything beyond that is considered state level society. So basically it's political organization as a factor of economies of scale or, organizing people. And obviously the dynamics of a group of say 100 people is going to be very different than the political organization of say 300 plus million people, such as what we're dealing with in the global economy today. And so it does have some utility, but I don't see any of these intro to anthropology textbooks really addressing it in those terms, at least in terms of populations. I do see it talked about in the intro to archaeology textbooks. When they talk about service, it's mostly centered around population differences as it being a key distinction between these political organizations. And then the last few categories we've got here are gender and sexuality, which sometimes get a chapter for each. Sometimes they're combined. A chapter on family, kinship, and marriage, that's always combined. I have yet to see them separated. And then a chapter on religion and belief. And those are basically the broad brushstroke chapters that you're going to get in an intro to anthropology textbook. If you don't see those, then you're probably dealing with something that's not an intro to anthropology textbook. You're probably dealing with maybe an upper division course that might be doing readings in anthropology. So maybe you're dealing with something that's not quite a theory course, but it's not quite an intro course. I do teach a class that's sort of in between in that regards. It's Anthropology 2010, Peoples and Cultures of the World. So it's not an intro class, but it's also not, it's a 2000 level class. So it's in between an upper division and a lower division class, I would say. And the difference that I found with those intro to anthropology textbooks, I should say, and the two that I called out earlier, the Robbins Cultural Anthropology and Ember's Anthropology, is that Ember Ember, and this one is from 2004, it felt more like the world prehistory and archaeology books, because it spends a considerable amount of time talking about like the history of humanity, talking about early human evolution, lineage, and all that kind of stuff. So it felt sort of in the same vein as that world prehistory stuff, even though it's clearly written for cultural anthropology courses. So I would have to put this in the same kind of category as those trying to do too much in one textbook and kind of bouncing around, expecting way too much reading, I would think, of their students. I mean, they've got 17 chapters, so not really too crazy. Oh man, did you hear that whistling? They've got 17 chapters, so nothing too ridiculous in terms of reading expectations, but I mean, you've got a whole section on getting food, so subsistence-based systems. You've got, Chapter 3, Primate Evolution, Early Hominids and Their Cultures, the Emergence of Homo sapiens, Human Variation. So it reads more like a physical anthropology textbook, though it's supposed to be cultural anthropology. And then the Robbins book is very much, I would say, it's more of like obviously it says the subtitle is a problem-based approach. It reads more like, raising questions and then having answers for them, and doesn't read like a textbook in the same regard, because it approaches things mostly from a research design standpoint. So things are organized not by necessarily content material, but more on problem solving and research design. So for example, like the first one, why do human beings differ in their beliefs and behaviors? How do people judge the beliefs and behaviors of others? So sort of these, I would say, epistemological questions, which seems, I think, honestly, a little bit higher level thinking for intro courses. So, like maybe for a, 2,000, 3,000, or 4,000 level course, this book, I think it's probably a little too simple for maybe a 4,000 level course, but certainly I think this is, at least for an intro textbook, it's a bit heady and a bit much. So these two in particular, the Robbins and then the Ember and Ember, I felt like I probably wouldn't use in an intro to anthropology course, mostly because in the case of Ember and Ember, juggling too much in one textbook, and then in the Robbins example, I think it's putting the headlights on things, so to speak, and that these are all really good. I mean, I think it's really important stuff for the students to know when they're taking an intro to anthropology class, but I think it's structured in a way that maybe focus more on the lower level thinking, like basic rote memorization, understanding key concepts. As much as I want them to start thinking and doing problem solving as anthropologists, we also have to be cognizant in an intro to anthropology course, 99% of the students in that course are not going to go on to be anthropology majors. So maybe it's not as important to make sure that they can do anthropology problem solving. As disheartening as that might sound, I do think there is some credence to that as well. The other thing I thought was interesting was the Ember and Ember cultural anthropology book from the 1970s felt more in line with the rest of the anthropology textbooks, like including the one I have from 2020. And then for some reason in 2004, they kind of reversed course, and instead of sort of focusing on key concepts, it kind of became this sort of catch-all book, sort of like the world prehistory books. So I thought that was interesting that the 1970s Ember and Ember felt more like an intro textbook, and then the 2004 version felt less so like one. So that's just some interesting observation I had about those textbooks. Let's turn to what other people are saying about the textbooks. I only pulled 2 reviews just for brevity's purposes. I pulled Mirror for Humanity, A Concise Introduction to Cultural Anthropology by Conrad Kotak. It's got 250 ratings, 10 written reviews, 3.52 out of 5, 3.52 out of 5. And I felt like this review by Morgan, December 26, 2009, 3 out of 5 stars. This kind of sums up, I would say in general, intro to anthropology textbooks. I read this for my intro to anthropology course in college and thought it was a good starter for the basics of anthropology. Had a lot of in-depth information and was very useful for understanding concepts and terms. The best way to get through this book, because it is a textbook and is in a textbook format, is to take it bit by bit. There are places where you can easily stop within a chapter and still understand what is going on. Very nice anthropology textbook. Yeah, so Morgan emphasizes something here bit by bit. I'm a glutton for punishment, obviously. I read textbooks for a podcast, so Some people might consider that punishment. But I read through, for example, Ken Guest's textbook because I felt the need to read through the textbook I'm going to be teaching in class and writing my own notes. And I definitely feel like textbooks in general are just written in such a way that it doesn't feel like, for the most part, they're supposed to be read page or cover to cover. And definitely even when reading chapters, there would be, your brain would almost go into autopilot in the sense of, oh, here's a call out, I'm not going to read it because after reading one or two of them, I realized I'm not really gaining anything from these, so I'm going to skip over them. Or, reading through the review questions. It really depends on your reading style and your study style. And I would say, honestly, with a lot of these textbooks, as Morgan points out in her review, take it bit by bit, but also be selective. Not every part of the textbook is something that you need, and I felt like a lot of the older textbooks were very much content-based and less about diversity and content delivery, whereas the 2020 Ken Guest version, you've got little snippets and examples. You've got definition callouts. You've got bolded text. You've got interviews with anthropologists. You've got your turn fieldwork sections where they give you a little exercise you can do on your own. So it gives you a lot of flexibility both as a reader and as an educator, choosing what you want to focus in on in each chapter, which is always, I think, something really nice with textbooks, is when it's just sort of content delivery written like a novel and there's not really callouts or anything like that. Sort of like the community civics book that we did 2 weeks ago, where there was like the beginnings of that sort of textbook format, but it wasn't quite there. I think it facilitates a much easier read with textbooks. So that's Conrad Kotak, Mirror for Humanity, reviewed. And then the other one I have is Cultural Anthropology, A Toolkit for a Global Age by Ken Guest. This is the 2020 version, although it says it was originally published in 2013, and it has a 3.39 out of 5 stars, so slightly lower than Conrad Kotak's. Only has 74 reviews and 4 written reviews. I like Elizabeth White's review from March 2nd of this year, 2021. Yet another textbook. Another example is from Megan S. of November 13th of last year, 2020. I didn't read every single excerpt in this book, but the ones I did read were really informative and interesting. I could read this lengthy, actually, I think I will read this one by Lolo S., who gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, August 10th, 2017. And this will be the last one I read before we kind of give our final thoughts on things. Lola says this: read this for a community college cultural anthropology class. Who knows? Maybe Lola was in mine. I don't know. 2017, probably not. I learned so much from this textbook. It covers a range of aspects of human culture: race, gender, sexuality, family, art, immigration, etc. The topics are viewed through the lens of globalization, how time-space compression and the mass movement of people and ideas are changing cultures around the world. I never took an anthro class in undergrad. After reading this book and taking the class, I feel like anthropology should be a required class, otherwise called, quote, How Not to Be an Asshole. It's eye-opening to realize that cultures the world over share the same struggles for power and revel in the same joys of art and tradition. Yeah, I think I kind of agree with Lola there. I feel like anthropology gets the short straw, or the shaft, you could say, at least in American high schools. High school students can take psychology, they can take sociology. I've never seen, at least in my experience, a high school class that's offered anthropology as a course that you can take. And I think that's to the detriment of everyone, because really anthropology does provide a lens from which to understand other people, other cultures, how to be understanding, to have cultural relativity, to check your own cultural bias. There's a lot of benefits to cultural anthropology, but you don't need to hear me stand on my soapbox and say that. This is coming from an anthropology professor. Of course I'm going to say cultural anthropology should be required for everyone to take. That would be counterintuitive if I didn't, right? But those are people's thoughts on these books. You can get the full list of my ratings of each of them on the book bin, the Google Sheet that you can get in the show notes. But basically, I would say most of these are going to get like a 3 out of 5. I'd probably say Ken Guest's gets a 4 out of 5. It's up there. I really like this textbook just because of, I guess that's partially because I'm so familiar with it. I'm most familiar with that textbook than all the others, even though it has some of the minor issues, like I've said with other textbooks, of rearranging the chapters with new additions, the issue of the Essentials 4 being different from the cultural anthropology textbook that I use. But I consider those minor differences in terms of content, overall delivery. But that's going to do it for this week's episode. Hopefully you have. Don't worry, we're going to put a pause on talking about textbooks for a while and switch over to something a little bit more interesting. And next week, we are going to be talking about The Viking World by Simpson, Jacqueline Simpson, published in 1980. That's going to be next week's book review. And until then, never stop reading. From the Archives is produced by Eric Olson, and its theme song is Lukewarm Hazy by Asher Falero.